"Stop playing pretend entrepreneur," Sarah announced at the family dinner, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension she'd perfected over the years. "Your little online thing isn't real business." Everyone laughed, even Aunt Linda, who usually played the peacemaker, joined in. I sat there frozen, my fork halfway to my mouth. My heart sank, but I didn't flinch. I nodded quietly, swallowing back the urge to shout, to finally make them all see me. "Understood." The words came out calmly, almost too calm, as if I was agreeing to something trivial, like asking if I wanted another helping of mashed potatoes. I forced myself to keep my face neutral, but inside, I felt the fire rising. I had spent years being dismissed, written off as the computer kid with no understanding of what real business was. Sarah, my golden child sister, was the one who had it all: Harvard venture capital media coverage. She was the one everyone looked up to. The one everyone thought would save the family's future. Meanwhile, I was building something of my own, quietly, without anyone noticing. No articles, no social media posts, no congratulations at family dinners. I was solving problems for some of the largest companies in the world, making millions without anyone being the wiser. It was exactly how I wanted it until tonight. As the laughter died down, I felt that familiar sting. How could they all be so blind? How could they not see that I was the one who had actually built something real? Not Sarah with her glossy startup, that was burning through capital faster than it was generating revenue. But I didn't say anything. I had learned the hard way that speaking up only made it worse. Every time I mentioned my work, the conversation shifted, and Sarah was back in the spotlight, regaling the family with stories of her latest business competition win, or internship at Goldman Sachs. I was the invisible man in the corner, listening to her talk about real business while my consulting firm made millions, but nobody knew it, so I kept quiet. Until now. That night, after the dinner ended and everyone had filed out, I stayed behind. I walked to my laptop, fingers hovering over the keys. The email had already been drafted in my head. I had been waiting for this moment. Sarah's arrogant little jab had sealed it. I opened my investment firm's email. The subject line read urgent, pull the $150 million from Sarah's tech startup. My finger hovered over the send button. I knew what this would do. It would shake her world, her carefully constructed image of success, to its very core. I hit send, and just like that, the $150 million was gone. The family's precious startup was about to implode. And they had no idea who was behind it. They thought Sarah was a genius. They had no idea who had been pulling the strings all along. The irony of it all was almost too perfect. The following morning, I woke up to a slew of missed calls. My phone buzzed nonstop. Everyone was trying to reach me, but I was already gone. My real business had been flourishing under the radar for years, and now, it was time for the world to see it. I had finally had enough. Growing up, the family always made it clear who the favorite was: Sarah, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. While I spent hours in the garage, hunched over a computer, building systems no one understood, Sarah was winning debate tournaments and running for student council president. She was the one Mom and Dad beamed over, their eyes filled with pride as she talked about her vision for the future. "Your sister has vision," Dad would say, as he listened to her talk about how she was going to change the world. "She's going to revolutionize the tech industry." Mom would chime in, nodding approvingly. Meanwhile, I was dismissed as the kid who played with gadgets. The computer kid. The one who didn't understand what real success looked like. I remember when I started freelancing at 16. Making more money than most of the adults in the family. Instead of praise, I got comments like, "It's just pocket money," and, "Maybe you should focus on something more serious, like Sarah's pre-law track." Every family gathering felt like a showcase for Sarah's achievements. While I sat quietly, listening to their endless praise for her, Sarah would talk about how she was going to attend Harvard Business School, while I had settled for a state school with a computer science program. She was going to change the world with her networking, her academic prowess, her internships at Goldman Sachs. She was rubbing elbows with future CEOs, while I was just sitting behind a screen, developing software nobody outside my industry would even recognize. When it came time to talk about my work, the conversation would shift back to Sarah's latest business competition win, or academic honor. I learned to stay quiet, to keep my head down and let Sarah shine. It was easier that way. It always had been, but I was okay with it. Or at least, I told myself I was. I focused on my code, my work, the things that actually mattered. Unlike Sarah, I wasn't interested in the spotlight. I didn't need the approval of the family. Or so I thought. The truth was, I had been quietly building something on my own, something that was growing far more successful than anyone knew. My consultancy wasn't a side project, it was a real business, generating millions for clients like Fortune 500 companies. But none of it mattered to my family. They didn't care about my success because it wasn't flashy. It didn't come with press conferences or LinkedIn updates. My success wasn't visible, but it was real. Meanwhile, Sarah's startup was getting all the attention. The family was pouring their savings into it, convinced that it was going to be the next big thing. Local newspapers were writing about her. She was being celebrated everywhere, at least in the family's eyes. Dad would talk about her company like it was already the next Silicon Valley success story. But what he didn't know was that I was silently working behind the scenes, watching her company burn through cash, knowing it wasn't going to make it. Sarah was running on optimism, not practicality, and her startup was hemorrhaging money. But the family remained hopeful, convinced that her Harvard education would eventually pay off. "It's just growing pains," Mom would say, reassuring everyone when the numbers started to look bad. "All successful startups go through this phase." Meanwhile, I kept my distance, watching from the sidelines, my silence growing heavier by the day. My bank account grew, but I drove the same used car and lived in the same modest apartment. The family assumed I was barely scraping by. They thought I was just some tech nerd who didn't know what real business looked like. They had no idea how much I was actually worth. They had no idea how much I was silently controlling. The tension between Sarah's public success and my invisible achievements grew with every passing year. Sarah's company continued to falter, her startup burning through capital like it was endless. And then, one day it hit me. I could fix it. I could save her company, but I wouldn't do it for her. I would do it for me, to finally make them see me, to show them that I wasn't the failure they had always thought I was. I became Sarah's largest anonymous investor, pulling strings from the shadows. And our $150 million, funneled through a series of shell companies and discrete investment vehicles. The family thought they were supporting her vision. They thought she had convinced serious investors to back her. They had no idea I was the one funding it all, calling all the shots. I structured the deal carefully, control over her company, but with the anonymity of a faceless investor. They thought they were backing a genius. What they didn't know was that the real genius was sitting across from them, quietly watching as Sarah strutted around, clueless about who was actually making it all happen. Every board meeting, every strategic decision was made by me. Sarah had no idea. She was still operating under the illusion that her vision was being evaluated by serious investors. What she didn't know was that the only serious investor in the room was her brother. The same one she'd spent years belittling. It felt like a game I had finally won. Sarah's rise was as inevitable as it was predictable. To the family, she was a shining example of success, smart-driven, and always a step ahead. It was a narrative they couldn't resist, the golden child, the one who worked hard, followed the rules, and got rewarded for it. She was the model of achievement, and they loved to talk about it. Every family gathering revolved around her latest triumphs, and as much as I tried to avoid it, I couldn't help but listen. Her startup, TechFlow Innovations, was the talk of the town. It seemed like everyone was rooting for her. She had built a network of investors, mentors, and advisors who praised her strategic mind. The press loved her, the family adored her, and I continued to be the invisible one. My successes remained tucked away in the shadows. I had created a multi-million-dollar consultancy that worked with Fortune 500 companies, but it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Silicon Valley. It wasn't sexy. To the family, it was just a side project. A little thing I did because I couldn't hack it in the real world. It was maddening. Sarah's company burned through its initial funding faster than I could blink. The excitement from the launch event quickly turned into panic when the numbers started showing cracks. Investors were getting nervous, but they kept throwing money at her, convinced that her Harvard education and networking abilities would turn everything around. She was still the golden child, the family's future, and they kept reassuring each other that it was just a phase. "It's growing pains," Mom would say, trying to keep the family's hopes alive. "Every startup goes through this. She's just learning," and I watched. I watched as she held press conferences, attended exclusive events, and got featured in magazine articles about rising tech stars. Everyone in the family hung on her every word. It was almost like a performance, and she was the lead actor. At every gathering, it was the same routine. Sarah would talk about her latest success, her latest connections, and how she was going to change the tech industry. Meanwhile, I'd sit there, silently, listening as they fawned over her like she was the only one who mattered. I was never the one to complain. I was never the one to shout for attention. But there were times, quiet moments, when I'd catch myself staring into my glass of wine, wondering how it had come to this. How had I built something so successful, and yet been so completely overlooked by the people who were supposed to support me? How had Sarah, who had never worked a day in the tech industry until her startup, become the center of the universe for the family? It was when Sarah's company hit a rough patch that I knew it was time. She needed help. Desperately. But she didn't know who to turn to. I knew she was running out of options. But I wasn't going to just step in and save her. She had made it clear enough that she thought I was nothing but a pretend entrepreneur. It was time for me to show her exactly who the real entrepreneur was. I could see the cracks beginning to show. Sarah was increasingly stressed, though she tried to keep up appearances. She continued to put on that confident face for the family, acting like everything was going according to plan. But I could see the fear in her eyes. The way she spoke less about her company's future and more about the hurdles that were slowing them down. The constant pressure was starting to break her. She still had no idea that I was the one pulling the strings. That her so-called investors were actually just my puppets, doing my bidding while she focused on networking and press releases. The control I had over her company was absolute. Every major decision was made with me in mind, even if she had no clue. The money kept flowing, but it wasn't going to last forever. And as her company continued to struggle, I knew I had to make a move. I wasn't about to let her fall flat on her face, not yet. But I wasn't going to save her the way she expected, either. She had underestimated me for far too long. I would let her think everything was fine, right up until the moment it all came crashing down. I had made my choice. I was no longer going to be the invisible one. I was going to show them exactly who had been keeping this ship afloat all along. The family dinner that night started like any other. Casual chatter, the clink of silverware on plates, and the usual back and forth about who was doing what in the family. But everything shifted the moment Sarah opened her mouth. "Stop playing pretend entrepreneur," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of amusement and disdain, like she was explaining something to a child. "Your little online thing isn't real business." The words landed with a sickening thud in my chest. For a split second, everything froze. I looked around the table. Mom, Dad, Aunt Linda, Uncle Robert, they all burst into laughter, their faces lighting up with approval. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I didn't react. I had learned long ago that reacting to Sarah's jabs only gave her more power, so I kept my expression neutral. My gaze shifted to her, but she was already looking away, satisfied with her little dig. She was the queen of the family, and everyone adored her. "Understood," I said quietly, my voice calm, almost too calm. I barely recognized the words as they left my mouth. I had always been the silent one, the one who never fought back, who accepted the roles handed to me. But inside, something was shifting. They didn't know it, but I had already made my move. I had already set things in motion. It had taken me years of sitting on the sidelines, watching Sarah take center stage, watching her soak up all the praise and admiration, but that night, something broke inside me. I realized just how much I had been overlooked, how much I had been underestimated. The silent, unspoken disdain I had carried for so long suddenly turned into something sharper, something calculated. And I couldn't keep it inside anymore. As everyone continued to laugh, I excused myself from the table. I could hear the faint hum of conversation behind me, but I didn't care. I made my way to the office, my mind already racing. I opened my laptop, took a deep breath, and began typing. "Urgent, pull the $150 million from Sarah's tech startup," I wrote, my fingers moving with a calm precision that belied the storm inside me. I reviewed the email one last time, checking every word for any hint of emotion. There was none. This wasn't personal. This was business. The business of proving to everyone, especially Sarah, that I was the one who had built something real. With a final click, I hit send. It was done. The weight of the decision settled in, but it didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something. The beginning of a shift. The family still thought of me as the guy who just dabbled in computers. They thought Sarah's success was inevitable. That her startup was the one that would change the world. But what they didn't know was that I was the one who had been quietly funding her all along. Pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They didn't see me as the decision maker, the real investor. To them, I was just the guy who worked in the background. They didn't know what was coming. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of what I had just done started to sink in. I had orchestrated it all, Sarah's success, her failure, everything. But the most satisfying part, she still had no idea. She would have no idea until everything came crashing down. And when it did, it would be my turn to step into the spotlight, to finally show them all who the real entrepreneur was. It was time for Sarah to see the truth. She would learn, the hard way, that the little online thing she had mocked wasn't just some hobby. It was a multi-million-dollar business. And it was the only reason her so-called real business was still standing. The following morning, The phone didn't stop ringing. The calls kept coming. My investment firm, Sarah's venture capital partners, my lawyer, everyone was in a panic. But I wasn't. I was too calm, as I sat back in my chair and let the chaos unfold around me. I had done it. I had sent the email, pulled the funding, and now, it was a matter of watching it all unravel. It was surreal, in a way. Years of being dismissed, of watching Sarah take all the credit, of being the invisible man in the family, all of it was leading to this moment. The moment when they would all finally see who had been holding the cards. I leaned back in my chair, watching the constant stream of emails and text flood in. Each one was a reminder of the power I now held. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but I didn't need to type. I didn't need to say anything. I had already made my move, and now it was just a waiting game. By the time Sarah called me, her voice had lost its usual confidence. It was shaky, almost desperate. "Something weird is happening with the investors," she said, her words rushed. "They want to meet tomorrow. They're talking about strategic repositioning and capital reallocation. I don't understand what's going on." I could hear the tension in her voice, the panic bubbling just beneath the surface. It was almost pathetic in a way. She had spent so long pretending that everything was fine, acting like she had everything under control, when in reality, she had no idea what was really happening. "Do you think it's related to the quarterly numbers?" I asked, my voice level, calm. "I don't know," she admitted. "The performance hasn't been perfect, but we're building for long-term growth. Real investors should understand that tech companies go through difficult phases before they scale." The irony of it all was almost too much to handle. Here she was, talking about real investors, unaware that the entire reason she was even in this position was because of my money, my decisions. She had no clue that the same investors she bragged about, those high-powered, high-profile names, were really just my front. "Maybe," I said, keeping my voice neutral, "but if they're talking about restructuring, then they probably have some serious concerns." She didn't reply right away. I could hear the wheels turning in her head, trying to process what I was saying, trying to make sense of it all. I knew what was coming next. It was inevitable. The emergency board meeting was called for the next day. By the time I walked into the room, it felt like the walls were closing in. The tension was palpable. Sarah was sitting at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her face pale. She still didn't know that everything she was about to face, every hard truth, had been set into motion by me. The venture capital representatives were already there, their eyes flicking nervously between the board members. Sarah tried to hold her ground, presenting her vision for the company, talking about market opportunity, about the future. But it was clear that the room wasn't buying it anymore. "The numbers were too damning. We've been patient," the lead partner from the firm said, his voice professional but firm. "But our analysis indicates fundamental problems with the business model and execution strategy." Sarah looked like she'd been slapped. She tried to push back, but the room was already turning against her. It was happening, the walls were falling down, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "We don't believe additional capital investment would be productive at this time," the lead partner continued, his words cold and final. Sarah's face turned white. Her eyes flicked toward me, confusion and disbelief flashing across her face. She was trying to piece it all together. She had no idea how deep my involvement in this was. She didn't know that the person she had been belittling for years, her little brother, the pretend entrepreneur, was the one who had been pulling the strings all along. "We've decided to withdraw our investment," the partner announced. "Effective immediately, we'll be liquidating our position and relocating capital to more promising opportunities." The room went silent. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her company, her future, was crumbling right in front of her. And she had no idea that the very person she had mocked was the one who had orchestrated it all. The silence dragged on, and Sarah was left in a state of stunned disbelief. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. How could she? The investment she had so proudly flaunted, the one she had built her entire business around, was gone. Just like that. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke. "You can't just withdraw the $150 million overnight. The company will collapse without that funding. We understand the implications," the partner said, "but our responsibility is to our own investors. We can't justify continued support for operations that aren't meeting performance expectations." Sarah's face contorted with frustration and anger, but there was nothing she could do. The reality had set in. She had gambled everything on a shaky business plan, and now it was over. I looked at her, finally giving her the full truth. "You were never in control of this company," I said, my voice calm. "I've been the one calling the shots from the beginning." Her eyes widened as she tried to process what I was saying, but I didn't wait for her to respond. It was too late. The damage had already been done. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence fill the room. The family, still unaware of the full extent of the situation, looked on in confusion. They didn't know what was coming next, but I did. This was just the beginning. The family was in shock. The realization had finally hit Sarah, but it wasn't just her who was reeling. Mom, Dad, Aunt Linda, Uncle Robert, they all looked around the room, trying to process what had just happened. It was like someone had thrown a bucket of cold water in their faces, and they couldn't seem to shake the disorientation. I sat there calm, watching as Sarah's world fell apart in real time. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of the table. The reality was too much for her to process all at once, and it showed in the way her eyes flicked between me and the venture capitalists who were still sitting across from her. She had trusted them. She had trusted me. "You're the investor," she whispered, her voice cracking, barely above a breath. Her expression was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something I couldn't quite place, regret, maybe, but that was a feeling I wasn't about to entertain. "Yes," I replied, my voice even. "I've been the one funding your startup, making the decisions, structuring the investments. All while you thought your so-called real investors were the ones behind your success." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy, and Sarah could do nothing but stare at me in shock. I saw the fight in her eyes, the hurt. I saw the sudden recognition that everything she had believed about her own success had been a lie. But this wasn't just about me. It was about everything she had built, everything she had worked for, her identity as a businesswoman, as the family's chosen star, all of it crashing down. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, as though the years of sibling rivalry, of belittling me for my hobby, had never existed. The moment she realized that I was the one who had been pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated everything, it hit her harder than anything else. It was almost like watching a building crumble from the inside out. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, piecing together the truth she had refused to acknowledge for so long. She couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said it all. She had been so certain of her own superiority, so certain that her education, her connections, her networking would make her a success. But what she didn't realize was that the real work, the work that mattered, was being done by someone who had been right under her nose the entire time. I let the silence stretch. There was no need to say more. The truth had been laid bare, and there was nothing Sarah could do to undo it. "How?" she finally managed to ask. Though I knew she wasn't asking how I'd done it. She was asking how I had gotten to this point without her ever noticing. How I had spent years quietly building something bigger than her startup, something real, and how I had done it without anyone knowing. The answer, of course, was simple. I had kept my head down and played my cards close. Unlike Sarah, who lived for the applause, I didn't need the world to see my success. I let her chase the limelight while I built something that would last. "Because I knew what I was doing," I said, my words cutting through the tension like a knife. "And because you never stopped to see who you were really competing with. You thought I was a joke. Well, now you're going to see how the game is really played." The silence in the room was deafening. Mom's face was flushed, her eyes wide in disbelief. Dad, who had always held Sarah up as the family's hope, was staring at me, the realization dawning slowly but surely. Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert were just as confused, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what had just unfolded. They had all been so certain that Sarah's success was inevitable. But I had been the one pulling the strings all along, and they hadn't even seen it. "Sarah," I said, turning my attention back to her. "You were never in control of this. You were never the visionary you thought you were. I gave you the capital. I gave you the structure. I gave you the power. And you thought it was all yours." Her face twisted with a mix of shame and anger. She had been the one to claim the spotlight for so long, and now the world she had built for herself was crumbling around her. I saw it in the way her hands gripped the table tighter, her nails digging into the wood as if trying to steady herself. "I never asked for your help," she snapped, her voice low, bitter. "I didn't need you. I never needed you to save me." I didn't respond at first. The words were empty. She had always been too proud to admit that she couldn't do it alone. But now, in the face of everything falling apart, her pride was the only thing she had left. "Maybe you didn't need me," I said finally, my voice hard. "But you've got me now, and we're going to finish this. Your company is going to fail, Sarah. You know that, right? It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when." She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of frustration and horror. The truth was there, written in the lines of her face, and she could no longer ignore it. She wasn't the one in charge anymore. And as much as she wanted to lash out, to scream at me, She knew deep down that I had already won. Then what? She whispered, her voice shaking. What happens now? Now, I said, leaning back in my chair, watching the devastation unfold. Now we rebuild. But this time you'll do it my way. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and an atmosphere in the family that could only be described as tense. Sarah, who had once been the shining star of the family, was now the center of a storm she didn't know how to navigate. She had spent years talking about real business, about her vision, her drive, how she was going to change the world with her startup. But now, faced with the truth, she was scrambling for control, and it was clear that the reality of what I had done was sinking in. I had pulled the 150 million. The venture capitalists, who had been nothing more than a front for my investments, had withdrawn their support. Sarah's startup, once poised to become a Silicon Valley success, was now teetering on the brink of collapse. And my family, was left to pick up the pieces. The evening after the board meeting, we sat together at the dinner table, and I could feel the weight of the silence hanging in the air. Sarah wasn't the same confident, self-assured woman she had been just days before. She was quieter now, more subdued. She kept glancing at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and anger. But I wasn't going to let her dictate the narrative anymore. She had made her own bed, and now she had to lie in it. Mom, as usual, was the first to speak up. We need to help Sarah, she said, her voice tight, as if she were still in denial about what had happened. This is just a temporary setback. We'll find new investors. She's too talented to let this fail. Mom, this isn't just a setback, I replied, my voice steady. This is the reality. Sarah built a company on shaky ground, and I gave her the rope to hang herself with. The words were harsh, but they were true. It wasn't the first time I'd said something like this. But now, with the truth finally out, it had weight. It was no longer an abstract criticism. It was the brutal reality of her failure, and she knew it. Sarah's gaze snapped to me, her face flushing with anger. You think you can just come in and destroy everything I've worked for? She spat, her voice rising. You think this is some kind of game? No, I said quietly, locking eyes with her. I think you've spent your whole life pretending to know what you're doing, when the truth is you've been skating by on a facade. The difference is, I've been here, making the hard decisions, while you were too busy making friends and looking good. The silence that followed was thick. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after something fundamental has shifted. Sarah, for the first time, seemed to truly understand the gravity of the situation. She had spent so long believing that her education, her network, and her vision would carry her to success. But none of that mattered when the fundamentals were wrong. None of it mattered when you didn't know how to run a business. Enough, Dad finally spoke, his voice strained. We don't need to tear each other apart. What's done is done. We need to figure out how to fix this. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't admiration for Sarah. It was a recognition that the situation wasn't as simple as he had hoped. Fixing this is going to take more than just money, I said. It's going to take hard work, and that's something we're all going to have to learn, including Sarah. She shot me a venomous glare, but I didn't flinch. This wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about her. It was about the company, the business, the future. She had always believed that success came from connections, from networking, from charm. But the truth was, success was about substance, and she hadn't had that. The next few days were spent in a whirlwind of phone calls, emergency meetings, and frantic efforts to salvage what was left of TechFlow Innovations. Sarah, ever the optimist, kept insisting that things would turn around. She talked about new potential investors, about reworking the business plan, about scaling back operations to make the company leaner. But none of it felt real. None of it felt like the solution to the deeper problem that had been staring us all in the face for years. Sarah wasn't ready to run a business. She wasn't prepared for what it took to make tough decisions, to understand the fundamentals of what kept a company alive. I took a step back, letting her struggle through it all. She needed to learn, just like I had. My success hadn't come from charm or connections. It had come from understanding the details, from making decisions when they mattered, from being patient when everyone else was rushing forward without a plan. As the days turned into weeks, the family slowly began to realize that Sarah's role in the company would have to change. There was no other way around it. The company had burned through too much capital, and Sarah had ignored too many red flags for too long. The restructuring process was inevitable. And then came the call that would change everything. It was from the board. They had decided to demote Sarah from CEO. I knew that moment was coming. I had already taken control, but now, it was time for Sarah to face the consequences of her own actions. She was going to have to accept a new role in the company, one that didn't involve calling the shots. She was going to have to learn humility. Sarah, we're bringing in experienced executives to handle the operations and strategy, I told her that night. You'll transition into a senior product manager role. It's not easy, but it's what's best for the company. The silence that followed felt like a punch to the gut. I could see the weight of the decision crashing down on her. The pride that had once defined her, the belief that she was the one who could change the world, was now shattered. And while part of me felt satisfied that she had finally learned the lesson she needed to learn, part of me, just a small part, felt sorry for her. But that didn't matter now. The company was mine to guide, and I was going to do it my way. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, steady shift. The family's dynamic had changed. And it wasn't just Sarah who felt the weight of it. We all did, but in different ways. Sarah, to her credit, didn't fight the demotion. She could have, but she didn't. She took on her new role as a senior product manager, without much complaint, though I could tell she was struggling to adjust to the reality of her situation. It wasn't just her pride that had been wounded, it was her entire worldview. For so long she had been told that she was the future of the family. She was the one with the vision. The one who was going to take us all to the top. And now, she wasn't even in charge of her own company anymore. I watched her from a distance, observing how she handled the transition. At first it was rough. She would still speak up in meetings, still try to offer suggestions and ideas, but they were quickly overshadowed by the seasoned executives I had brought in to steer the company back on track. It was a humbling experience for her, but it was one she needed. I could see it in the way she started to listen more, to absorb what the experts had to say. The arrogance that had once defined her was slowly being replaced by something else, something more grounded, more focused. In those first few weeks after the restructuring, I took control. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes she had. I knew the business inside and out, and I knew what had to be done to turn it around. The company wasn't going to fail. It wasn't going to be another statistic in the startup graveyard. I made the tough calls, restructured departments, cut costs, and started the slow but necessary process of rebuilding the foundation. The company was in the red, but not for long. As Sarah settled into her new role, I saw a shift in the way she interacted with me. The resentment that had been there was still there, but it was quieter now. It wasn't the venomous anger she had once directed at me. It was something more subdued, more resigned. She wasn't the person who had tried to mock me for years anymore. She was a different version of herself. One who had learned the hard way, that running a business wasn't just about talking the talk. It was about walking the walk. The family started to notice too. Mom, who had once been convinced that Sarah was the one who would save the family, began to acknowledge the quiet success I had built over the years. She would mention, almost in passing, how impressed she was with my consultancy's growth. Dad started asking me questions about business strategies, about investments, about the industry. It wasn't much, but it was progress. They were beginning to understand that success didn't look the way they had always thought it did. It wasn't about networking or glamorous press releases. It was about substance, about building something solid and sustainable. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Not just by Sarah, but by the family. They had always viewed me as the kid in the background. The one who was doing something less important, less real. But now, they couldn't ignore what I had built. They couldn't dismiss me anymore. As for Sarah, she started to excel in her new role. It wasn't easy, but she had the tools now. She had the humility to learn, to listen, and to grow. I saw the change in her, slow but steady. The business that she had tried to build on her own was finally starting to come together. But it was my guidance, my patience, that had given it the foundation it needed. The company wasn't just a reflection of Sarah's vision anymore. It was a reflection of the lessons we had both learned, the lessons that came from failure and redemption. A few months later, I received an email from Sarah, completely unexpected. She thanked me for saving the company. It wasn't the apology I had been expecting. Hell, I wasn't sure I wanted one. But it was a sign of growth. She acknowledged what had happened, and in her own way, she admitted that she had been wrong. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was enough to know that she had learned, not just about business, but about me, about what it took to succeed and what it meant to truly respect someone else's path to success. The company eventually turned a profit. It wasn't the kind of explosive growth Sarah had originally hoped for, but it was steady, sustainable. We had built something real, and for the first time, I could say it was truly ours, both of ours. The family's perception of success had shifted. Sarah's MBA, her networking, and her Harvard connections were important, yes, but they weren't everything. It was the quiet work, the unsung efforts behind the scenes, that had truly made the difference. My success, which had once been dismissed as a hobby, was now recognized for what it was: a real business. As for me, I didn't need their validation anymore. I had built something, not just for myself, but for the family, and in the end that was enough. The pretending was over, for both of us.